All right. Hey, everybody. This is the voice of Julian. I help run the demandcurve.com marketing training. I also write TechCrunch's marketing column, and I used to run marketing for a company called Webflow. So we're splitting up this webinar into three sections. We're going to have two short, rapid-fire batches of insights from our two guests, Heaton and Justin. Then we're going to do a joint Q&A where I'll join in also. Our first guest is Heaton, but I'm going to introduce Justin first. He's my co-founder here at DemandCurve. And he was the director of growth for the Bell Curve marketing agency, which we run. So Justin's helped grow over 150 companies, a third of which are YC. And prior to that, he was Grammarly's growth marketing manager, where he oversaw tens of millions in ad spend. But most importantly, he's the resident expert on our team for idea validation and MVPs. So when we screw up, he's the guy who points out how we screwed up and how we wasted so much time doing the wrong thing and testing the wrong way. And that is the heart of this webinar. That's why we're running this webinar. And as you guys probably know, Heaton is the best known product-focused marketer on the internet, period. And most importantly, the go-to expert on product validation. His startup, which I'm sure you guys have heard of, usefyi.com, connects the document apps you use every day and lets you find those documents in just a few clicks directly within your Chrome tabs. He's also, with his co-founder Marie, runs producthabits.com, where they share product development how-tos and insights based on all those learnings they get from running Use FYI and Product Habits itself. Okay, Heaton, we're going to kick to you for the first 10 to 15 minutes of insights.
All right, I'm getting started. Idea validation helps you waste less time and money. I know this is obvious, but this being an advanced webinar, I wanted to start with something that people forget. You're so excited about your idea and all you really want to do is go build it. And you sometimes forget that you need to validate it. You need to make sure that whatever you're doing, you're wasting the least amount of time, least amount of money possible. And that's what I see most people fail at, even really advanced folks, even myself often, where I just want to go build it. And I forget to go actually validate it. So these days I force myself to actually go validate even when I'm sure or think I'm sure. So this is really the key to it as far as all my experience and everything I've done and helped other people do, which is really you're looking for finding the fastest path to learnings. What that means is that when you're validating an idea, you're looking for, okay, how can I go from what Peter Thiel calls 0 to 1 as fast as possible? And 0 to 1 in this context is what's the fastest way I can learn? Not the fastest way I can build it, not even necessarily the fastest way I can get something in customers' hands, not the fastest way I can get people to buy it, but how do I figure out the fastest path to learnings for the ideas that I have? And that's what validation is all about. That's why I got a race car here and I got a book open. One thing that I have to say, and it's a mistake that I see happening over and over again in the world in general, especially with sites like Product Hunt, that you can put an idea out and then basically see the world kind of react to it and generally get hundreds, if not thousands, if not tens of thousands of people looking at it, regardless of who you are. And that's great. But what that really means is that it's easier than ever to get something out there. And I would say harder than ever to have the discipline to actually take a step back and validate ideas. One of the ideas that I worked on with my co-founder Marie was called Draft Send. If you go look it up on Product Hunt, you'll see that it launched with a lot of fanfare. Where basically the site's live right now, but it's basically dead. It doesn't have high retention. It's not working. And we actually wrote a lot of code before we validated that idea. And this was a few years ago. So it's not like I'm any better at this and I have the best discipline all the time. And I'm always forcing myself to think through these things now over and over again. And I'll give some examples later because I don't just preach, I also practice what I preach, so to speak, and build this stuff myself. So I'll give some examples that I actually haven't really shared as much about FYI, my current company that Julian mentioned. So this has to be kind of hammered in your head. Writing code is an expensive way to validate ideas. Doing research is a fast and cheap way to learn. I kind of debated this sentence. I wanted to say doing research is the fast and cheap way to learn, but I know there are some people who would say, well, I can write code really fast, and I get it, but research is actually faster, and more importantly, it's cheaper. to learn. It's the cheapest way to learn. So for us, like the way we think about it when we do a lot of this work, and I'll give some very concrete examples in a second, is we do surveys, interviews, and we do competitive analysis. And that's how we essentially do research. And we really do believe it's the fastest way to learn. Over and over again, I find that folks don't necessarily approach it this way. And that's when they end up failing slowly instead of failing fast. So one of the keys here is also about validating ideas, so you're failing fast and you're failing into success, so to speak. So if you want to write code, make sure it's the absolute fastest way for you to learn. Just like I was saying earlier, you can write code. That's your tendency. That's what you most likely want to do, regardless of what I tell you today. And really, when you do that, you want to make sure it's the fastest way to learn. And that's how I approach it. I wait till writing code is the fastest way to learn, and then we write code. What that means is we're doing things before we write code. So like I said, I'll give an example from FYI. It's my current company. I'll tell you more about it in a second, even though Julian already kind of blew up my spot by saying what we do and what we learned. And I'll talk about the journey and the things that we use to learn really fast before we started writing code. I really believe in surveys. I don't believe in market research surveys where you're asking a lot of 0 to 1 questions and making people rate a bunch of things. What I really believe is in surveys that enable you to learn as much as possible. This is really the key survey question when it comes to idea validation. I'm going to read it, and I'm going to read the description that we put in, and I'm going to explain why we did it like this. So what we asked people before we built FYI, after we failed a bunch of times writing code and not validating the ideas properly, we stepped back and said, well, what do we need to do? Well, what we need to do is we need to discover what the biggest challenges that people have. So the way we thought about it is, what's your single biggest challenge when it comes to creating and sharing documents? And what we asked people to do is we told them to please provide as much detail as possible about the challenge you face. The more information you can provide, the more it will help us create software that will be super valuable to you. The reason we did that is we actually wanted essays. A lot of the times you don't want essays. You don't want a lot of content when people are filling things in or when people are writing to you. In this case, we wanted to know everything we possibly could about what people's single biggest challenge was when it came to creating and sharing documents. I'll do a sidebar real quick. When I talk about this, a lot of people are like, oh, how do I find people to interview and things like that? Or how do I find people to survey? I would say that one of the best sources, I'll give one tip of doing this, is actually going on Twitter and finding people who are talking about different problems that they have, or talking about certain products that you think you could get them to sort of use that to get them to kind of fill out your survey. So there are a number of different ways. And I think Twitter is one of the most exciting ways that I've found to really engage people and get them to fill out surveys or even get them to talk to you in an interview. So what we learned, and this kind of sums up in a really strong, in a big way, with the sentiment that we learned when we asked that question about the challenge. And this is literally from someone who filled this in. They said, finding the docs easily and keeping them well organized. That's the challenge that we discovered when it came to people's number one challenge when it came to documents in terms of creating them, sharing them, and that kind of whole space. We basically wanted to learn what's the biggest challenge in the document space. That was a high-level thesis and the thing that we want to learn the most about. So moving on, when we get into interviews, what we do is we focus on understanding and learning from people based on stories. And really, one of the key questions we ask to get stories is literally asking people, do you have any stories about when something went wrong? And there's many different ways to ask this. What I find is that in interviews, people are not being conversational. They're not focusing in on learning from the other person. And they're also not sitting there and trying to understand, okay, what are the stories that people have to say? Because really what I look for is I look to get stories out of people about specific experiences that they've had, ideally ones when things have gone wrong. And when we look at like 20 interviews or even just up to like a dozen interviews and we've gotten stories out of everybody, we start finding what I call the pattern of pain. What we're really looking for is what is the painful thing that people are going through that we've learned from these stories. So in this sort of example, what we did is we asked people about documents and how they've been creating and sharing them. And then we asked them to tell us when something went wrong, like when they really needed to find a document and they couldn't find it. And so here's an example of what we learned from a lady who was working on a team, and she was looking for basically a document. So this is the example, and she mentioned this about the whole company and what they were going through. So let's assume this is like an e-commerce brand. So for example, Mother's Day, marketing team will be like, hey, what's been finalized? Then ops team will be like, just look in Google Drive. Things like that continue to happen. First thing people do is go on Slack or email, a lot of sunk time. This is literally word for word what she was saying when she was talking to us and telling us a story of when things went wrong. And she gave the example from Mother's Day and exactly what happened, which is people kept asking each other for documents that they should already have access to, that they do already have access to, just because they didn't know how to find them, they didn't know where they were, and they were kind of in a rush. And we heard things like this over and over again, and that's what really helped us develop the full-on thesis for FYI and how we built it. So another tactic I use for idea validation, and this one's one of the most fun ones because it's a lot of data that's already out there, is using Net Promoter Score, using customer reviews and website analysis. And so when it comes to Net Promoter Score, I'll give an example of what we've been doing at FYI and how we think about it. When it comes to customer reviews and website analysis, you don't have to talk to a single customer, and you can read reviews of other websites. You don't have to talk to a single customer, and you can analyze websites and what people are saying on them. So that's the strongest example I can give, which is you don't need to talk to anyone, and you can go on this hunt to figure out what customers actually think. And the reason we do competitive analysis is not because of our competitors. We do competitive analysis because we want to understand how customers think about the competition, how customers think about alternatives to our product. So here's an example. And I would say I haven't seen that many people do Net Promoter Score on their competition or on what I would call alternatives to their product. So for our product FYI, we connect to all those different document apps, including Dropbox, including Google Drive, OneDrive, Box, etc. And so we wanted to basically get as much information as we could about how people think about these products. And one of the reasons is these are alternatives to our product. Basically, if you are looking for documents today, one way that you do it, besides asking people, like the example I just gave from the story we heard, is you'll go in these document apps and you'll try to search, or you'll try to find the document in these apps. So we really wanted to understand what people thought about these apps. So we've got probably the biggest, outside of any single company, sort of database of Net Promoter Score and what people said about the reason for their score out of anyone in this space. And we did that by literally asking these two survey questions, the Net Promoter Score key question, and then asking people to fill out what is the most important reason for their score. So we got a lot of rich information as a result of that, and we've even published it. So we created this little graphic, and what we learned is that G Suite has about a 35, and Confluence has a negative 38. And this Net Promoter Score is a customer satisfaction score, as I'm sure many of you know, and the key to it is that it can go all the way down to negative 100, which means people are really not satisfied at all. And it can go all the way up to 100, which means like this is like the best product on the planet. And products like Apple and Tesla are hitting like 70 to 90, roughly speaking, depending on what score you look at. And these emoji represent how people really feel. So if you think about this, when we did this survey and got these scores, this is kind of the results. Like people are really not satisfied with most of the products in the space for a number of these reasons. And it goes to show why there ends up being a lot of new products in this space. People are just not satisfied. So there will be new products coming out constantly in this space. This is the type of stuff you can learn when you start looking at competitors in this way. And so what that resulted in, all that research resulted in something that I would also call competitive research, which we call the 5-day MVP for FYI. So one thing that people think about when they think about solving the problem of finding documents is they think about a search box, and they think about building a search box. And so what we did is we thought through, okay, we've got all this validation that the number one problem people have is finding documents across all the apps they use. We looked at a competitive landscape of companies that came before us, and a lot of them are basically in a graveyard. They basically died. And we wanted to understand, why did they die? And one of the ways that we could do that, now that we were at this phase of the business, we've done a lot of research, we've done a lot of surveying, competitive analysis, and interviewing, is actually build an MVP. We wanted to build it as fast as possible. We actually built it in 3 days, shipped it internally, and then actually launched it to a total of about 20 to 50 different users in 2 different batches. And all it did was it connected to all these apps, G Suite, Dropbox, Slack, Box, and OneDrive. the easiest ones we could connect to. And then it gave you the search box. And it was a really simple product where when you started typing in the search results, it would ping the APIs right away. There was no storage happening on our end. And we basically were able to determine with this, we wanted to know this basically. We were able to determine what the answer was to the idea here and whether a search box was good enough for people finding their documents. And so what we learned is basically that they won't. They don't use a search box. They won't use a search box to find their documents. And what we actually learned is that they'll maybe use it once a month, but they won't use it that much. And it was just from asking this key question that I mentioned, which is, will people use a search box to find documents? And the answer is basically no. And so that led us to a lot of iteration away from the search box. But we basically saved ourselves months, if not years of work of building this solution, which is what I would call the obvious solution. So now today, I'm not going to blow up and tell you what the non-obvious solution is that we've discovered that's working and that we have product market fit with, which is FYI. You can go there yourself, but one of the reasons that we even came up with this value prop is because find your documents in 3 clicks or less implies that you're actually not searching. And we also do have a search box in case you want to search. So that's my story. That's my process for idea validation that anyone can use, and a key example from my own business, FYI, that you can check out at usefyi.com if you want to. And from that, I am turning it back over to Justin and Julian.
Awesome. Thank you, Heaton. So we have some good questions. What I'm going to do is read them to you, a couple. And feel free to just say pass, or if you want to answer it, go for it. Does that sound cool?
I love answering all the questions, so I'll do my best to answer all of them.
All right, here we go. Let me dive in here. How long did the research, survey, and interview process take for FYI?
Yeah, research was done within about a week, and we were able to get a lot of responses. We have an email list that helped us, and if I were to do it today, it might take about 2 weeks if we were to do it from scratch and didn't have any respondents. Interviewing was about probably a total of about 3 to 4 weeks from start to finish. And then the competitive analysis, like we're able to do that really fast. Like I'll jam for like 16 hours on competitive research and basically take everything, read everything I could find, and then basically categorize it. So that usually takes about 2 to 3 days if you're willing to spend about 8 to 12 hours each day on it.
Great. We're going to do about 5 more questions, then we'll throw to Justin for his batch of insights. Next one is it a good idea to pay for people's time to get your survey questions answered?
I tend to not recommend that. I would use a product like Ask Your Target Market. SurveyMonkey has a bunch of panels, and there's a few other businesses that do panels. I would not recommend paying directly in the way of like, hey, you have an email list or something and you pay people to fill out the survey. But if you need panels, SurveyMonkey and Ask Your Target Market are 2 different products that allow you to go get at people. But that means you need to have money. So the scrappier way to do it would be, like I mentioned, on Twitter or LinkedIn or other places, and literally message people and get those responses going.
And speaking of which, Ali asks, how do you make Twitter work as a source for respondents if you do not have a large Twitter following?
Use the search box. It's surprising and pretty powerful that a lot of people have direct messages open. And if you just appeal to them and tell them what they're doing and ask for like 3 to 5 minutes of their time, they will fill out a survey for you. It doesn't really matter who you are.
And how do you decide on Twitter exactly, and you're welcome to defer this one if you like, how do you decide exactly who to reach out to on Twitter?
I just start doing a lot of searches and searching for things that are related. So for example, we might type in like Dropbox sucks, or we might type in Notion rocks, or we might type in Google Drive in Twitter and just see what people are tweeting and then go after it. Twitter is so large now and people are so vocal. I think that it's sort of not hard to find things as long as you're willing to do a bunch of searches and look for people.
And once you have these people, Jackie asks, how do you motivate them to fill out a particularly long survey?
I don't usually do long surveys. I do about 5 to 10 questions, and the incentive I give them is that they'll get early access to the results. So don't just do a survey and just say, oh, this is for me. I'm just going to look at it myself, or our team's going to look at it. We do like to kind of share a blog post, or at least share with all the people that filled it out. And that gets you to give them your email. They give you their email. And a lot of people are just willing to help because they want their problem solved. So it's not as hard as you might think to get them to fill out the survey. I don't like super, super long surveys, but I don't also do really short surveys either.
And speaking of how those surveys are conducted, what are your thoughts on email versus in-person the various ways of engaging to give a survey?
I would do all of the above, depending on who your audience is and where you can reach them from.
Awesome. And a few more questions, because I think people are really digging this. A lot of questions are coming in, and so I'm gonna lead into this for a little bit.
Yeah.
Cool. Oh, I like this one a lot. Okay, David asks, what are things you can't come across in a survey that you could only get from a customer interview?
Oh, stories. It's much easier to get stories and emotion from people in an interview. It's possible in a survey, but you have to really add some caveats. So for me, like, interviewing is all about stories. It's all about emotion. It's all about what I would call love and hate. And I think love and hate are so important when you're doing research, because you want to figure out what people love, but what people hate. I mean, I run and this is a tactic I did not explain, but what we do is we run user tests on other people's marketing sites. And what we do is we have a very specific process to make people do something they normally wouldn't do, as everybody knows, is read every section and tell us their reaction to it on a marketing site. Because everyone uses long marketing pages, we don't. But what we're looking for is what's the one value prop that people love, and what are things they hate, and then we basically pop that up to the top. So if you did like 5 user tests on 5 different sites, marketing sites in the same category, you would learn a ton about what people love and what people hate. So for me, just dovetailing on the question, I just want to know what people love and hate, because once we figure that out, we can really start digging in and understanding what people's actual challenges are, and plus like how to solve them.
Awesome. We're going to do a couple last ones. Here's a nice loaded question for you.
Yeah.
Should you do these surveys if you're building something to solve your own pain?
I think it's even more important to do it at that point, because you could be what I call smoking your own crack. And what that means is like you just want it to exist so bad that you just want it to exist and you want to solve your own problem. I actually am of the camp of it's great to start a business in many different ways. Your problem, someone else's problem, whatever. But what's more important is knowing that other people have that problem too, and getting into all the nuances of it, because you're probably going to be wrong with what you really think, or there'll be nuances that you're missing, or you're totally right, but at least then you know that there's a market out there for it too.
And a couple of specific questions is a two-parter regarding the search feature you discussed for FYI. So first, Dallas asks, how did you actually come to the conclusion that people won't use the search box? Was it just watching customers use the product? And then the follow-up is, how did you know that you wanted to test the search feature to begin with?
We wanted to test the search feature because we knew that there were products in the market that had failed just building a search feature. So they spent years working on it. And there's some really high profile companies that have done that and ended up being acqui-hired or shut down, that just built a search across all the different tools you use. And so we wanted to figure out what were they missing? What did they get wrong? So we figured out a way to build it really fast, just connecting to all those APIs. Then what we did is, once we realized we needed to build it, we built it super fast, as I mentioned. And then we got it out to a bunch of people and we interviewed them. And we actually made the requirement of them using it early that they fill out a couple surveys for us too. And in those surveys, we started asking questions about what they were doing. So it's a combination of qualitative information from interviewing and surveying and really understanding their sentiment about it. And then also looking at behaviorally, what was the retention rate and how often did people use it? And what did they say? A lot of times they just said, I forgot to use it. A lot of times they just said, oh, it's faster for me to go ask somebody, believe it or not. A lot of times they would just say that, like, yeah, that's not how I find documents, and things like that. So we learned a ton just from building that and spending about 2 weeks getting people using it and learning from that.
Awesome. Very last question, then we're going to throw to Justin for his batch of insights. The question is, are there any no-brainer questions you would really want to ask across all surveys?
Yeah, that challenge question. And there's one that I really love, which is, how can you help us build this? And then I ask them, meet in person if in my local area, Skype interview or Hangouts interview, user test for me, or fill out more surveys. And that's a question I really like to ask in this process, because then you get a whole bunch of people that are willing to help you even more. So if you were to ask me, the 2 questions are the challenge question and this question. There is a third set of questions that I would also ask, which is anything you need to know about demographics. So if I'm building a product for teens, I might ask, are you a manager? Yes, no. If I'm building a product for companies in a similar fashion, I might ask what their job title is and company size. In fact, we learned a lot about the number of document apps people use based on company size, because we asked which document apps they use and how many of them they use at the company. And also we asked them what their company size was.
Awesome. So thank you so much, Heaton. We're going to come back to Heaton at the end of the webinar. We're going to do another joint Q&A with both myself and Heaton, and also Justin. So speaking to Justin, Justin's going to walk us through his portion of this webinar, his rapid fire insights. He's going to be doing some advanced high-level strategy. So keep the questions coming if you want specific details about anything he talks about. And this is going to be pretty cool. Go ahead, Justin.
All right, thanks Heaton, thanks Julian. Let's jump on in here. So to reiterate what Heaton said regarding why we use validation tests, why do we do this? The reason we run MVPs, validation tests, A/B tests, surveys, all these different tools, it's ultimately to produce a learning, right? Something we can use to determine how we invest our time, our resources, help de-risk our decisions, and ultimately help us identify our most impactful opportunities as fast as possible and as cheaply as possible, right? So there are really two main components here. First, identifying what you need to learn, and then second, figuring out the fastest and cheapest way to get that learning. And it sounds really, really simple. And in theory it is, yet I watch so many teams, founders, mine included, make countless mistakes here. It's not easy in practice. So I want to spend my time surfacing some of the most common mistakes that I see companies make, and hopefully help some of you prevent some of you from making the same ones. So the most common mistakes when it comes to validating ideas, the first one, not knowing what you want to learn. So the classic example here is a team building a new feature, shipping it to their users, and then quote unquote kind of just seeing what happens. And believe it or not, this is a really common scenario. I've worked with a lot of different companies on multiple occasions, and I'll ask the team, why are you testing this? What are you trying to learn? And quite frequently you'll hear, we really hadn't thought of it that way. It was more, let's get it out there and find out. And that's a major problem, right? What happens is a team spends weeks or months building an MVP, they launch, and then they get these middling results, which is really common with an MVP. It's not a great product. It's not, that's the whole point. It's not fully polished. So you're unlikely to get amazing results. You probably won't get, crickets, something in the middle, and that's really hard. So they have no idea if it's a success or a failure. And as we just said, the number one goal of a validation test is to produce a learning. In this scenario, quite frankly, it's a bit of a failure because we did not produce any clear learning. And I want to make things a bit more concrete here by giving some examples of, what are some good examples of learnings they could have been going for. So a few examples. Do users even experience the pain that this feature is solving, right? Is this even a problem? Is this feature the best way to solve the user's pain? So again, not jumping to just building and then shipping, understanding, is this idea, this feature, even close to the best way to address this pain? And then kind of more globally too, a good learning is just how much revenue or business impact can this feature produce if we were to build it? These are all simple examples, but good examples of what a good learning might look like. And we'll go into this more later, right? But what we want to do instead, right, is identify the biggest or riskiest assumption of the thing that you're making. What is the one thing, if it's not true, that would invalidate this entire project? Identify that, and then design a test to validate that specific assumption. And now, before moving on to all these other kind of common mistakes, I do want to take a moment just to kind of point out just how simple and easy these mistakes are to make. We've made them many times ourselves at Demand Curve. And some of the, hopefully these are somewhat relatable, some of the reasons, we've postmortem these and realized why we made the mistakes is, one, we thought we had validated all of our major assumptions. And this is at least for our team. This is sometimes because we thought we had the expertise in a certain market or a certain topic. We thought we had things de-risked, and then we jumped in, started building or testing way too soon, and missed some core assumptions. Another common one is, we kind of follow the mantra, like most startups, most teams, of moving really fast. And we'll get we'll have a new idea. It appears big on paper. We'll get excited about it. And then, because we do want to move quickly, we'll jump in, start testing, and we'll sometimes kind of skip over some of our best practices, or some of our, validation processes that we're going to be talking about, ultimately because of that excitement. So again, just two kind of simple, but hopefully relatable examples of, our team does this. It's sometimes easy to, even though you should be doing certain things, it's easy to skip over them when you are making some kind of false assumptions of your own, or getting just too excited and wanting to move too fast. All right, common mistake number 2 is picking the wrong thing to learn. So this is a bit better than the first one, right? You've at least identified a key learning, but in this case, you picked one that isn't actually the most critical. So a quick example here, let's say you run a supplements company. You want to see how much revenue potential a new supplement line has before you invest in manufacturing it. So you decide to run an MVP to see if people will buy it at all. That last statement, this is key. This is a big mistake, okay? What you really needed to know is what percentage will buy in order to determine the scale and the impact. Because what you said you ultimately care about is the overall revenue potential, right? So what you should have done is picked a small subset of customers, run the MVP to them, learn what percentage bought, and then extrapolate that out to see if the revenue gain is going to be over or under whatever your kind of success threshold is. So for example, we only move forward with a product that can make $100,000 a year or a month in revenue. Set that threshold, run this small test, extrapolate the data out, and then if it crosses that threshold, then proceed to basically step 2, right? All right, so on to number 3, not designing your test to get the learnings that actually matter, right? So also an improvement from the first 2. You've identified the right learning, but in this case, your test isn't actually designed in a way to get you the learning that you're going after. So another example, let's say you are a SaaS company. You're currently catering to small businesses, and you are working on a new product to tap into the enterprise market, right? So you decide to use your current user base to validate this product. And this is another major issue. You might feel like you're doing the right thing since you're running a test, you are getting learnings. But in this case, your learnings are from the wrong market. Your current market, again, small businesses, yet the new product is designed for enterprise. So this validation test, this MVP, the results are not going to be valid, right? So what we have to focus on is ensuring our actual test design reflects the reality of this idea. And moving on now to number 4, not setting success and failure thresholds, and then almost just as important, not mapping those outcomes to clear next steps. So let's say you want to validate a new feature, and you ultimately care about how long users are going to use that feature. What we want to do, we want to predetermine the following. We want to say, if users spend more than 20 minutes with this feature, we'll invest in building a V2, for example. If users spend less than 5 minutes, we're going to kill the project entirely. We're going to stop investing in it. If users spend between 5 and 20 minutes, we're going to interview users. We're going to figure out if we can close the gap, or maybe we'll invest in new ideas from the backlog to keep improving the feature. But the key takeaways here, 1, that learning must be measurable, right? Must be quantifiable. And then each possible scenario of your test must have a clear next step mapped to it, right? We can't leave room for middling results. So one of the most common kind of death traps of MVPs is that middling kind of limbo land. So make sure every possible scenario has a clear action item associated with it. Okay, on to number 5, actually one of my favorites here, and he can address this a little bit too, but building something too soon. So let's say you have an idea for a productivity tool, and your core hypothesis is, I think the majority of professionals experience this problem and would be willing to pay, let's say $100 for my solution. The first thing to note is that your real assumption is that people experience the problem in the first place, right? Validate that first. Nothing else really matters. Nothing matters about, validating demand or validating pricing. And what's the fastest way to validate if they experience that problem? It's probably not building an MVP or building a landing page or coding anything. Instead, it's likely hopping on a call with a few potential customers, sending out an email, but learning firsthand that problem is real, right? And just how painful that problem is. So the key takeaways here, don't default to building when a phone call or an email would have produced the same learning in a fraction of the time. And don't skip the research, right? As Heaton said. The other thing, a bit of an aside but related, but I think is really helpful to think about, is we want to view these tests as kind of unlocking phases, right? So we want to start with the easiest assumptions to test and then work up from there. I think so often people start by trying to validate their most complex or biggest assumption. If there are smaller assumptions that you're making that are equal to or really close to the importance of the bigger ones, if we can test those first, start there, of course, right? Start light and then work your way up as you continue to validate things. I'm going to mistake number 6 here. Really, it's people testing things when they should not. It's over testing. And this is really simple, but it's also really important, especially for those that are doing a lot of A/B testing. So the main takeaway here is just not everything, one, can be tested, okay? So truly novel, groundbreaking ideas really cannot be validated easily, at least not with conventional methods. So just, take the classic anecdotes of the transition from traveling, with horse-drawn carriages to going to cars. Had you tried to validate if people wanted cars at that time, they would have thought you were insane, right? People just often don't know what they need until they have it in front of them or until the market conditions, have changed accordingly. So if you're working on huge ideas, just recognize the limitations of what can and cannot be validated. And then on the flip side, really, really small ideas should often not be, tested as well, right? Especially when you have, limited traffic, limited users, as most early stage companies do. And the reason being here, right? Testing small things takes a ton of time. The smaller the change you're trying to detect, the more data and the more time you need. And this is precious when you're a startup. So main thing here, reserve your testing for the big stuff. And now finally, mistake number 7, people are focusing on the what over the why. And for those of you who've been testing things for a long time, this may be really obvious, but for others, maybe not so much. The example here is, let's say you follow kind of the classic advice, right, of a lot of the blogs that we read about, growth and marketing blogs. And in order to optimize our landing page, you decide to test, a new color of your sign up button to see if it increases conversion. And you run the test. It turns out it leads to a 5% increase in a sign up rate. And that's great, right? Sort of. So while the 5% lift is nice, you only learned what happened. You learned that changing the button color increased sign up rates, but you really have no idea why. And this is the biggest kind of pitfall with A/B tests. They're really great at getting the what's, but not so much with the whys behind it. And when it comes to validating ideas, again, our real goal is, as we've said, producing a core learning of some kind. So what we want to optimize for here are the whys. And had you done that upfront research, maybe it's user interviews, maybe it's screen recordings, heat mapping, what you might have learned is people are actually having a really hard time seeing that old sign up button at all. It was blending in. There was low contrast between the button and the background, whatever it may have been. But that's the real reason changing that color improved the conversion. And that's the why of what we're looking for, right? So with that knowledge, with that core understanding, there may have been far more impactful, optimization that we could have made other than just testing that button color, to address that problem, right? So takeaway here is the whys are extremely impactful. With the whys, you can think of so many solutions to solve the core problem. What's can only kind of take us directionally where we want to go. All right, guys, that wraps it up. Hope the seven common mistakes were useful. That's the end of my insights. I'm going to open it up to questions.
Cool.
Julian, what you got?
Awesome. So we're going to answer a few questions here, and then we're going to do a joint Q&A between Heaton, myself, and Justin, answering any of your growth questions on any topics. We'll have fun, and we'll dive in until Heaton tells us to screw off and go home. So, all right, on to Justin here. Keep the questions coming in. Could you give a couple more examples of picking the wrong thing to learn when running a test?
I think a really classic one is people focusing too much on binary results. So I think a classic kind of MVP, it's kind of it's like that smoke test of sorts. So people will build a landing page. They'll put up, a product that hasn't really been built yet, and they'll see if they can get some purchases. And it feels good, right? You built a landing page, maybe you can get a couple purchases. But to me, that's the wrong thing. Asking the question of like, will people buy at all? That to me is a mistake. You can't do that much with it, right? Let's say maybe you spend $2,000 on ads. You get one person to buy, 2 people to buy. That's nice, but I think a more constructive way of running these tests is saying, for me to actually validate this idea, I need to, for example, I need to be able to produce purchases at a specific, cost of acquisition, or I want to use this, I have to use this channel and must be able to produce, 10 sales with my $1,000 to spend. You want to figure out what is that core assumption, right? Like, I think another example would be, just
Actually, I'll cut you off there just so we can get more questions. How do you know you've spoken to enough people? And should you be thinking about a percentage of respondents who said they wanted what you're selling, or should you be thinking about an absolute number of people who said, yeah, I want this?
Yeah, we're not asking people if they want it. We're asking people what problems they have. And so first, I would say it's a mistake to think that you'll get in these interviews and ask people if they want something. That's not the goal. This is not sales. This is validation. So validation really means that you have a hypothesis about a problem that your product will solve, that you can almost shove the product away and say, hey, that's on the side. Like, I don't care about that. What I care about is learning what problems people have. And so if you take that lens on it, for me, the way I do it is I'll do interviews until I'm bored. And so usually that happens around, if I pick the right demographic of people to talk to and it's not that wide, happens around a dozen interviews or so. And I'm like, okay, I'm hearing the same thing over and over again. I usually would do a few more and then stop and then analyze kind of those interview results. But these are like 20-minute interviews. They're pretty meaty, actually. I wouldn't call those short. And I end up getting a lot of information just from like a dozen people.
Awesome. And this is for both Justin and Heaton. Blogs you recommend that elaborate on the frameworks Justin shared and the practices Heaton shared?
I got a book. There's a book called Lean Customer Development that I would highly recommend, especially around the hardest part of some of this stuff, which is the interviewing processes and things like that. And then there's a lot of product folks on Twitter who are tweeting about product related stuff, and a lot of them get into research and things like that. I would say that today I can't point you to one definitive resource about idea validation.
Sounds good. Heaton, how and when do you test pricing?
I like surveying for pricing, and I've written a whole sort of series of emails on the product habits list with my co-founder and the folks at Price Intelligently. So I would say surveying for pricing, and that's what I would recommend. And so we did that with FYI even before we built the product, once we knew kind of some of the features we wanted. And so there's a bunch of surveying methodology that I would highly recommend over doing A/B tests on pricing after you launch. And then typically, depending on the type of business you are, I think e-commerce tends to be a little bit different. But when it comes to software as a service and subscription, you should be adjusting your pricing pretty regularly, at least 2 times a year, I would say, if I were to put a kind of number of times to up to like 4 or more.
The question basically from Gina is, how do you decide which is the biggest risk and assumption that will invalidate this entire project? Justin, do you have an answer for that one?
Yeah, it's hard to give exacts, right? Because that is very case by case. But I think ultimately what is helpful is trying to kind of do some sort of almost like flow charts, kind of like this if this then that kind of diagram, where you can basically work backwards and kind of figure out if this happens, then then this might happen. And you can kind of form this chain of events and usually get close to figuring out, okay, this is what's really dependent on this whole thing working. But yeah, it's hard to give exact. It depends on the your resources and your industry and all these things, right? But yeah, generally going that exercise of kind of mapping things out and kind of in phases, it will get you closer at least to figuring out what is really the riskiest thing you're working on.
Bijan asks how to find out if users will actually put money on the table for the next feature you plan to build. And he says, according to one framework, asking customers, would you pay for this, is not the way to go. So I want to jump in with my thoughts here. I think there is an ocean between capturing someone's intent to buy and actually having them buy. And I'll give you guys an example right now from Demand Curve. So we launched a product a little while ago, and we set up a type form survey and asked, hey, would you be willing to pay once we're ready? A lot of people filled it out, and they said, yep, I'm ready. Just tell me when. And the number who actually bought was minuscule. And I don't think there's anything clearly wrong in our funnel. I don't think there are any clear bottlenecks in the funnel. And I'm still validating that. But the point is, capturing intent will not genuinely validate whether your business can make money. And so I'm scared, and I've seen this play out many times in the past. So I'm actually scared of capturing intent to purchase. And I would challenge people to try to capture the actual payment. If people aren't willing to put money down, even if it's like a reservation, maybe it's like a 20% down, whatever it is, if people aren't willing to do that, I would question whether you've truly captured intent. Our friend of Demand Curves, Justin Mayer, is the founder of a company called kettleandfire.com. And it's like a bone broth product. And he built a fake e-commerce landing page and actually made sure people were putting down their credit card to reserve a spot. And only when he hit a threshold of people who paid down did he actually place the whole order with the co-packer. So I truly think you're going to lie to yourself otherwise. But this is specific to whether it's going to economically break even. As to whether you should start a new startup, I'm not saying you have to ask for money from day one if you're testing a new SaaS product. But if your goal is to find out, will this make money, you have to actually find out, will people pay me? Let's go to the next question. Heaton, this might be a bit too abstract, so you're welcome to deflect this one, but what's the best way to structure your thesis? Something you mentioned at the very top of the webinar.
Yeah, I think the simplest format for this is what they call kind of hypothesis. So you can probably read up on this, Google it a bunch, and figure out like customer development hypothesis and get a lot of good answers. For me, it's just like X customer has Y problem. And it's as simple as that. So my hypothesis would be people at companies have a problem collaborating on documents. And the more specific I can get, the better. So people at companies have a problem collaborating with other teams inside companies because they're using different tools. So X type person has Y problem, and then the because Z reason is kind of a iteration on that, but something potentially really powerful.
This is a good one. Justin, well, let's do rapid fire answers though, because I want to bang through a few in like 5 minutes. How do you decide if you should kill a product you've already built?
Yeah, so the shortest answer is back to kind of one of these mistakes we talked about, which is setting clear thresholds. So what we try to do is we know as a company what's important to us, revenue-wise, for example, that's one of our core metrics. And we try to, design our test to be able to basically predict that revenue potential. And if during that test, it does not hit our threshold, let's, for this example, let's say, oh, we don't think this can make, $1 million a year, whatever it might be. We will set a lower end to it, and if it's below that end, we'll kill it. So it's all about setting those clear thresholds. And one thing to add, because this payment validation topic has come up a bit now. We mentioned one tactic is kind of that the fake landing page, if you will, before the product is ready. There's also kind of more natural ways or authentic ways, which is you could just do a pre-orders or a coming soon type of thing as well, where people do pay for it. They're pre-ordering. That's a bit more authentic. It's a little bit less hacky than doing a quote unquote smoke test. So just for what that's worth, that's also an option.
Yeah, awesome. Justin, how do you narrow down the personas that actually have the problem? So some groups might need something a lot more than others.
Yeah, that's actually a good Heaton question too, probably with surveys and interviews. But I think the quick answer is, ideally you've identified those personas or segments on your own, and hopefully you have some hypotheses around each one. And then, we do validation tests, or we do, again, interviews, surveys for each one. And as you collect that data, you can kind of figure out, okay, there's the pain is really with this one segment, or wow, we have all these insights from this one segment we weren't even aware of. We can address those. It's a bigger opportunity. So it's mainly doing research at that segment and persona level.
All right. And Alex asks, so Justin, you earlier mentioned it's really hard to validate huge big leap ideas like Uber, perhaps, or Airbnb. What is the border between a huge idea with a big leap? And
I understand where it's coming from. It'll of course be a bit hard to define. Generally, when I hear people talk about this, right, they kind of use the term like new world solution. So creating a whole new world versus just iterating on an existing solution. So, if you're building something that is basically, dependent on the success of a certain platform taking off, or you're dependent on some sort of big market shift. Basically, you're dependent on something that does not exist right now. If that's your scenario, you're probably working on one, a bigger problem versus a more iterative one.
Yeah. All right. If you have any comments, ways we can improve this webinar, feel free to drop them in the chat feature. There's a chat button at the bottom of the Zoom window, as opposed to the Q&A button. Let us know. We're going to answer, I think, a couple last questions here. Eugene asks, if you're not hitting your thresholds, how do you reasonably conclude that the product is the problem and not the creative or the targeting and so forth? So I'm going to give my take on this, then I'll throw to Justin. So it's very helpful when testing something to have an actual experienced marketer running the channels responsible for bringing in those test people, because you want them to at least control for it not being a failure of an implementation. You want a minimum threshold of quality on, say, your Facebook ads funnel, so that you know that's not some glaring bottleneck that's invalidating your MVP sort of erroneously, right? So I think that's the one thing to keep in mind, is try to quality control where you're getting people from. Justin, what are your thoughts? I'm going to repeat the question. How do you conclude the product is the problem and not the creative or the targeting or some other aspect?
Yeah, well, I'll just build on Julian's. I mean, this is not easy, and it actually relates to another good question of like, how do you know all of your risky assumptions? But in this case, maybe you recognize that your team, you're all engineers, you built a great product. You recognize one of your risks per se is not having that marketing expertise. If you can go through that right exercise and identify that is a risk for you, then you very well might, design a test to basically validate that exact thing, to hedge against that exact thing. A way to do it is what Julian said. If you go, our risk is not being marketers, the risk is basically testing this improperly, then you might come to the conclusion we do need an expert to help with this test to prevent against the exact thing you're saying, which is getting basically a false negative. So yeah, I'll pause there.
Neil, are you around? Just sanity checking because I might give you a question if you'd like.
I am around, yeah.
Awesome. Your mic is at 3% volume, so get that jacked up. Let me try one more test.
Is that any better?
There we go. Beautiful. All right. I love this question. If you want to deflect it back to me, you're welcome to. Here we go from Ali, he says, or maybe Ali, or she. If you're building a landing page to validate an idea and to show it to people, how do you know whether you should actually take the time to build it? So in other words, how do you know when you should actually build a landing page or not?
Well, I would say that greatly depends on the resources you have. Like on our end, we use a site building tool called Webflow. And for us to build a landing page would maybe take us a few hours to do. Whereas a team that isn't necessarily have much technical expertise and don't have those people on staff, then it's a little bit harder to do, and you might want to think of ways that you can still validate the idea by doing things easier, such as doing a survey. But for us, it's very easy to throw up a landing page. So if we have an idea for something, we're pretty quick to create one and make it, and then try to put it in front of an audience, either through like by sharing it social media or through email or some other method, or even just linking it in our nav bar to see if anyone takes.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And also for knowing which landing pages should be built using, say, Webflow, or even knowing which surveys to build. The way I think about it is, if you don't have to be overwhelmed by how much work it would be to make a really good landing page. Your only goal is to get a landing page that at least gets people interested, and later you can iterate to improve conversion rates and so forth. I mean, only unless it's wildly underperforming, like just really poorly, and like it's two people out of 1,000 or something, would I then start spending the time to make it much better. But I usually will be quick to at least put up a landing page and assess, do people even want this? Because what you're really hoping for is a surprise that a ton of people do. And you're kind of waiting for those gems. And so you're not going to find those gems if you don't at least position yourself with a landing page. And then in terms of which landing pages to build, I'll also think about it from an audience segmentation perspective and a product segmentation perspective. So I usually have one landing page per product. And if I'm catering to multiple audiences that are wildly different, I might also have within each product different landing pages for each of those major differentiated audience segments. Neil, would you like to do one more, or should we wrap up?
Sure, I can do one more.
All right. Greg asks, I'm looking for an audience of quote unquote entrepreneurs, not founders, so aspiring founders, that are already part of a startup community online. Any idea where I might find them to test my product?
I would say there's a number of communities, such as, I think Indie Hackers is probably a pretty big one, as well as like Y Combinator also has something called Startup School, which is like a free, completely open version of Y Combinator, which, if you don't know, it's like an incubator program in Silicon Valley. And it has upwards of 25,000 companies in it.
That's it for today's webinar. You can check out demandcurve.com for details on our growth marketing training program and other cool growth related products that we work on. Have a great day.